Good afternoon. After this wonderful presentation about indigenous cinema, I want to problematize a little bit the category indigenous, and I will explain in a short while how I got into that question. There's a very personal background. I mean, we could also talk about, I think I refrained from raising that question in the context of cinema, but so basically my presentation is divided in 3 segments. I don't have a paper to read out, so I will just show you some photos, not very high resolution, but I think they will serve the purpose, I hope, and also talk you through in 3 key segments. The first one is, as I said, I had to confront this question around 2013. I wrote a small article in Bangla for a little magazine. Now, little magazine, I don't know if it is any longer in vogue in the West, but in South Asia, there was a movement in the 60s and 70s, and it is a little bit of a hangover from that period. Some young people still are into the little magazine. So somebody came to me and said, we would like you to contribute an article. So I had this question in my mind, so I ended up writing in Bangla. Is there something called indigenous poetry? And there was a very personal background to that story, because I used to teach at a public university called Jahangirnagar, and one of my former colleagues, I left after 10 years of teaching for reasons I will maybe mention later. A colleague came up to me, phoned me and said, we are having this poets festival and we'd like you to join as an Adivashi poet. And something about me, I had a gut reaction. I did not want to wear that hat. First of all, because I don't consider myself a poet, you know, I don't write a lot. I mean, I have written, everybody in Bangladesh writes poems once in their life. So in that sense, everybody is a poet, right? But I don't consider myself like a celebrated poet. So and also this category, this tokenism, oh, you want an indigenous poet. So something about that. So that's why I wrote this. And, but just by coincidence, a couple of months later, another he was also an academic. He said, personal background to that story, because I used to teach at a public university called Jahangirnagar, and one of my former colleagues, I left after 10 years of teaching for reasons I will maybe mention later. A colleague came up to me, phoned me and said, we are having this poets festival and we'd like you to join as an Adivashi poet. And something about me, I had a gut reaction. I did not want to wear that hat. First of all, because I don't consider myself a poet, you know, I don't write a lot. I mean, I have written, everybody in Bangladesh writes poems once in their life. So in that sense, everybody is a poet, right? But I don't consider myself like a celebrated poet. So and also this category, this tokenism, oh, you want an indigenous poet. So something about that. So that's why I wrote this. And but just by coincidence, a couple of months later, another he was also an academic. He said, we would like to include your poem in this anthology of Adivashi poetry. I said, what poem are you talking about? So turned out that it's been already published without my knowledge in some other, which is, it was called Exile Words. I wrote in Bangla, and it was not really a poem as such, but something I had written in my diary. I'll tell you the story, but the first anthology in which it was included was edited by a Bengali, somebody I knew actually. It's called The Fragrant Flowers of the Forest. My record of what I went through, that was in 1989. Anyway, then I wasn't very enthusiastic about that being included again, but they ended up including again without my consent. Anyway, these things happen in Bangladesh. But, and it's a contrast to the notion of sovereign words. Maybe I will try to add a footnote along that line. Instead of sovereign words, you know, I'm talking about exiled words. And when I got the invitation, oh, incidentally, thank you, Katya and everybody behind this workshop. I think it's a great opportunity for me to be here, and I've enjoyed it a lot. Anyway, I happen to be teaching a course on language, society, and culture right now, and there I was reading something from Bakhtin, Mikhail Bakhtin, who has a view on language totally different. Like, we don't control words. You know, they are populated, overpopulated by the meanings imposed by others and so on. So I was actually curious to learn a lot, like the notion of sovereign words. Anyway, so my exiled words, what I was talking about, it was more of a self-reference, like I stopped writing. And it happened in the context of, in 1989, and the picture that you see, Kavita, you're here. And we have a friend, Tonda, if you could just, she's the one I got the photo from. She's preserved it, and I got from her Facebook post. This is actually a historical moment in time in the context of the struggles of the people of the CST. That, just to provide some context, the Bangladesh was under military rule, and I was a student back then at the US. I was a graduate student at the University of Berkeley, California, Berkeley. And I took a semester off because I had crisis. I didn't know if I wanted to continue with the graduate program in anthropology, etc. I took a semester off. I was just hanging around in Bangladesh, going to places. And one day I ended up entering into a verbal fight with a military officer. This was at the height of military rule in the country as a whole, and also Chittagong hill tracts, heavily militarized. But anyway, I don't have time to go into all the long story, but this famous army officer kicked me out because he called us uncivilized. I stood up, I said, why did you call us uncivilized? And you know, we got into an argument, and he said, we're not here to argue about rights. If you don't like it, please leave. And I left. But it kind of, a lot of people, and the strange thing is that many of my relatives also were upset that, who is he? Why did he have to like speak up like that? You see that the problems are quite complex. Anyhow, just by coincidence, about a week after that, a massacre took place in a place called Longudu. And then, that was the first demonstration of its kind organized by the students from the hill tracts in Dhaka. And you have to imagine that the public space was heavily controlled. So it was, but the political parties were trying to also open up space. It was in that context, this demonstration, silent procession was possible. And I was just there as an onlooker, but the organizers invited me to join them at a press conference, and I also started answering questions of the press. And when somebody asked me, who are you? Before I could answer anything, somebody said, he's the president of this ad hoc committee. And you know, like, you have to imagine, print media was heavily controlled, but in the evening, everybody listened to the BBC, Voice of America, All India Radio, Akashvani. Under the leadership of Prashanta Tripura, the CST people organized, and I felt so embarrassed that it felt like I stole the credit. And then I got a telegram from home, luggage coming, fly back. I said, because people connected the dots and they thought that it was, you know, my response to being kicked out to the military by the military officers, so I must have done something. So I instantly became overnight hero, but I didn't want that limelight. So, and I was asked not to go home because if I went home, the military will come after me. So anyway, it was in that context that I had nothing to do, and I wrote a diary, and this was one of the poems, like exiled words. is this from? Anyhow, but you see, it just becomes fragrant flower, another fragrant flower of the forest. This is what I mean. Then this is from May 2000. The first one I told about the exiled words. This is in Bangla I wrote. This one I wrote a poem in 2012 called The Wasteland of Me, of course. Maybe I'll just read out a few lines and you'll know what it is about. I think some of my friends would know about it. This I had written in English and goes like this. April is no longer the cruelest month, at least not for me, not for the hills of Chittagong, where May is now the month of maximum cruelty, mixing memories of despair and dislocation and desires for freedom and equality, breeding hatred out of the scorched land, stirring deep. Sorry, I didn't bring my reading glass, so I can't. But the point, I think I have it in my pocket, but it's not important. But what prompted me to write this poem was somewhere there was a girl, Chakma girl called Shujata. Again, the same place where that massacre took place in 1989, same village. It's not a village, not a place I had been to, but the name, the Longudu, the place name, it's stuck. A girl was raped and killed. 14, also poor girl, just out looking, and just by some ordinary Bengali, not like the military or anybody, just another. But that sort of created, and just in about another week's time, another Adiva, Shujata. The name Shujata, it's sort of, I have deep memories because Shujata is, as some of you might know, is the name of a woman who saved Buddha when he was starving. He offered milk. Anyway, and the name sort of deep memories for me because my mother used to have a stitch work called Shujata. Although my family is like Sanatan Hindu, but you know, it was quite a kind of multi-religious type of, my parents had that attitude. So there was a stitch work of Sujata. So something about that sort of brought me and really so I ended up writing about that. And the other girl was only a 7-year-old girl by the name of Shagori. Beautiful names, very poetic names, Shagori, Sujata, but she was also dead, raped. And I should just add as a footnote, none of these cases, I have written later articles about these two girls, what they represent, like our collective impotence. We cannot do them, we cannot protect them. And there are multiple vulnerabilities. They're poor, they're Adivashi, they're girls. So you have it, it's not like there are many layers. And we move on. We don't remember those cases. And none of these cases have yet been solved. Anyhow, so this I wrote. But this was a time when I also decided to quit. After leaving academia, I used to work for UNDP. It was a huge project, comfortable job, but I had some crisis, so I had quit that job. And I took up writing things. And I'm just going to show you a picture. This is something called Cultural Diversity Festival. And one of my jobs, unfortunately at that time I was a manager. This happened in December 2011. I was one of the senior managers of the project. It's a huge 160 million project over 10 years type of that project. Shantosh, he's here. We used to be colleagues. And he remembers the sleepless nights we had like for about 2-3 months in preparation this festival. Unfortunately, it so happened that it was just always called Cultural Diversity Festival. But notice the year. It was the year when the government introduced a constitutional amendment recognizing, from the government's point of view, the indigenous peoples for the first time, but minus using the word indigenous. Instead, they introduced words like tribe, minor race, and in Bangla, for a lack of better word, what I would translate as minor anthroposect, just to give you a flavor of the linguistic impact, because they consist of commonly unused Sanskrit words. So minor anthroposects. Just imagine you are a minor anthroposect. All right. And there was a huge resistance to this. So what happened when the notice of this Cultural Diversity Festival went out? At that time, we had also decided to organize it under the ministry, the government, instead of allowing NGOs or etc. Anyway, I don't have time to get into all the details, but there was a huge backlash. And UNDP came into, so we had to organize right here in this very premises, Shilpakala Academy, under police protection, etc. It was a horrible situation. We organized because the sort of the propaganda was that, oh, the UNDP is using the hated term minor anthroposect. How dare they? They have abandoned us. It wasn't really like that. It was the government sending out, and they had used the word minor anthroposect. Anyhow, but so we were sort of caught in between. For me, it was extremely draining experience. I'm not saying I left UNDP for that, but it, I think, contributed to my decision at the end to quit that job. Anyhow, the official invention of what I call micro-anthroposects, Khudro Nrigoshti is the term, Nri. Nri is a very sort of Sanskrit root word. Now it actually, there's an evolution. I did some research on it. In 2006, for the first time, there was something called natural cultural policy. And there, in Bangla, they say Khudro Nritattik Janagoshti, which literally translates as small anthropological groups. Now, some people object to the word tribe. In Bangla, it means sub-nation, upojati, sub-nation. Who are we sub to? We are independent people. We have our cultural autonomy. So, no, we're not sub. Okay, as an alternative, it was also a misname, like minor anthropological group. How can you call somebody an anthropological group? Anyway, so in 2010, a government enacted a law renaming Tribal Culture Institute into using this word for the first time, called Khudro Nrigoshti, KNSI, and for some strange reason, they are not translated in English, they are just said Khudro Nrigoshti, so it's called KNSI in Bangla acronym. Anyway, so it's like Tribal Culture Institute suddenly become micro anthroposect cultural institute all over Bangladesh, including here, and this one is an invitation. By that time, I had left UNDP and I had started writing against this very thing on social media, newspaper, etc. in Bangladesh, and organizers of this event. This was the one I was referring to yesterday. There's like going to be some archive of material culture of the minor anthroposects. But the organizers, they knew how I would, they say, oh, it's Adibashi archive. When I came, I saw. Anyway, that prompted me to write a piece back then, like, is the museum, this archive, going to be the final destination of this indigenous people? Anyhow, in 2011, this is the exact title in the Constitution: The Culture of Tribes, Minor Races, Ethnic Sects, and Communities. What it says is basically the state shall help promote and preserve the culture. Note, culture in English, this is the official English translation. It is a mistranslation, nonetheless it gives you an idea of the official mindset. Minor race. In 2011, when the race concept is being abandoned, Bangladesh is embracing the race concept. It's racialization of indigeneity, ethnic identity, that kind of problem. But most indigenous activists who represent the indigenous people missed one point, which was that not so much the absence of the word Adivashi here. It was just an appendage to what is basically culture. And culture understood in a very narrow sense, culture being arts, culture being dance, etc., etc. And for example, this institution is under the Ministry of Culture, just like those small anthropological groups, culture institutes are this Ministry of Culture. Okay, and it was as an afterthought that, oh, okay, so it is more of a bureaucratic view towards promoting and protecting so-called tribal. Even if they had the word indigenous there, it would not make much difference, because elsewhere in the constitution, there is no recognition of the linguistic diversity of Bangladesh. There is no acknowledgement to the fact that indigenous peoples have had different relationship to land, etc., etc. So all those have been erased, and Bangladesh is defined as a land of Bengali people. It is the Bengali people who fought for liberation. It is Bengali. So even if you had the word indigenous, that very, very homogeneous notion of nation would still be there. And it is that I think we need to really question rather than the terminology involved. Anyway, so these are the things I have been writing about. And just another piece of, these are my parents. And something just as a background, just as I was very drained, both of them had passed away by that time, but we had a family event in memory of their late parents. And I just thought I would show the photos because look at my father. My parents represent maybe second generation of Tripuras whose families had switched from shifting cultivation to wet rice agriculture. And their cultural model had become the Bengali Babu, which Kavita represented. The Babu class that the British colonial rule had introduced. So Bengali Hindu elite in Calcutta. We would like to include your poem in this anthology of Adivashi poetry. I said, what poem are you talking about? So I turned out that it's been already published without my knowledge in some other, which is, it was called Exile Words. I wrote in Bangla, and it was not really a poem as such, but something I had written in my diary. I'll tell you the story, but the first anthology in which it was included was edited by a Bengali, somebody I knew actually. It's called The Fragrant Flowers of the Forest. My record of what I went through, that was in 1989. Anyway, then I wasn't very enthusiastic about that being included again, but they ended up including again without my consent. Anyway, these things happen in Bangladesh. But, and it's a contrast to the notion of sovereign words. Maybe I will try to add a footnote along that line. Instead of sovereign words, you know, I'm talking about exiled words. And when I got the invitation, oh, incidentally, thank you, Katya and everybody behind this workshop. I think it's a great opportunity for me to be here, and I've enjoyed it a lot. Anyway, I happen to be teaching a course on language, society, and culture right now, and there I was reading something from Bakhtin, Mikhail Bakhtin, who has a view on language totally different. Like, we don't control words. You know, they are populated, overpopulated by the meanings imposed by others and so on. So I was actually curious to learn a lot, like the notion of sovereign words. Anyway, so my exiled words, what I was talking about, it was more of a self-reference, like I stopped writing. And it happened in the context of, in 1989, and the picture that you see, Kavita, you're here, and we have a friend, Tonda, if you could just, she's the one I got the photo from. She's preserved it, and I got from her Facebook post. This is actually a historical moment in time in the context of the struggles of the people of the CST. That, just to provide some context, the Bangladesh was under military rule, and I was a student back then at the US. I was a graduate student at the University of Berkeley, California, Berkeley. And I took a semester off because I had crisis. I didn't know if I wanted to continue with the graduate program in anthropology, etc. I took a semester off. I was just hanging around in Bangladesh, going to places. And one day I ended up entering into a verbal fight with a military officer. This was at the height of military rule in the country as a whole, and also Chittagong hill tracts, heavily militarized. But anyway, I don't have time to go into all the long story, but this famous army officer kicked me out because he called us uncivilized. I stood up, I said, "Why did you call us uncivilized?" And we got into an argument, and he said, "We're not here to argue about rights. If you don't like it, please leave." And I left. But it kind of, a lot of people, and the strange thing is that many of my relatives also were upset that, who is he? Why did he have to speak up like that? You see that the problems are quite complex. Anyhow, just by coincidence, about a week after that, a massacre took place in a place called Longudu. And then, that was the first demonstration of its kind organized by the students from the hill tracts in Dhaka. And you have to imagine that the public space was heavily controlled. So it was, but the political parties were trying to also open up space. It was in that context, this demonstration, silent procession was possible. And I was just there as an onlooker, but the organizers invited me to join them at a press conference, and I also started answering questions of the press. And when somebody asked me, "Who are you?" before I could answer anything, somebody said, "He is the president of this ad hoc committee." And you have to imagine, print media was heavily controlled, but in the evening, everybody listened to the BBC, Voice of America, All India Radio, Akashbani. Under the leadership of Prashanta Tripura, the CST people organized, and I felt so embarrassed that it felt like I stole the credit. And then I got a telegram from home, luggage coming, fly back. I said, because people connected the dots and they thought that it was my response to being kicked out to the military by the military officers, so I must have done something. So I instantly became overnight hero, but I didn't want that limelight. So, and I was asked not to go home because if I went home, the military will come after me. So anyway, it was in that context that I had nothing to do, and I wrote diary, and this was one of the poems, like Exiled Words. Is this from? Anyhow, but you see, just becomes fragrant flower, another fragrant flower of the forest. That this is what I mean. Then this is from May 2002. The first one I told about the exiled words. This is in Bangla I wrote. This one I wrote a poem in 2012 called The Wasteland of Me, of course. Maybe I'll just read out a few lines and you'll know what it is about. I think some of my friends would know about it. This I had written in English and goes like this. April is no longer the cruelest month, at least not for me, not for the hills of Chittagong, where May is now the month of maximum cruelty, mixing memories of despair and dislocation and desires for freedom and equality, breeding hatred out of the scorched land, stirring deep. Sorry, I didn't bring my reading glass, so I can't. But the point, I think I have it in my pocket, but it's not important. But what prompted me to write this poem was somewhere there was a girl, Chakma girl called Shujata. Again, the same place where that massacre took place in 1989, same village. It's not a village, not a place I had been to, but the name, the Longudu, the place name, it's stuck. A girl was raped and killed. 14, also poor girl, just out looking, and just by some ordinary Bengali, not like the military or anybody, just another. But that sort of created, and just in about another week's time, another Adiva, Shujata. The name Shujata, it's sort of, I have deep memories because Shujata is, as some of you might know, is the name of a woman who saved Buddha when he was starving. He offered milk. Anyway, and the name sort of deep memories for me because my mother used to have a stitch work called Shujata. Although my family is like Sanatan Hindu, but you know, it was quite a kind of multi-religious type of, my parents had that attitude. So there was a stitch work of Shujata. So something about that sort of brought me and really so I ended up writing about that. And the other girl was only a 7-year-old girl by the name of Shagori. Beautiful names, very poetic names, Shagori, Shujata, but she was also dead, raped. And I should just add as a footnote, none of these cases, I have written later articles about these two girls, what they represent, like our collective impotence. We cannot do them, we cannot protect them. And there are multiple vulnerabilities. They're poor, they're Adivashi, they're girls. So you have it, it's not like there are many layers. And we move on. We don't remember those cases. And none of these cases have yet been solved. Anyhow, so this I wrote, but I also, this was a time when I also decided to quit. After leaving academia, I used to work for UNDP. It was a huge project, comfortable job, but I had some crisis, so I had quit that job. And I took up writing things. And I'm just going to show you a picture. This is something called Cultural Diversity Festival. And one of my jobs, unfortunately at that time I was a manager, the Ministry of Culture, just like those small anthropological groups, culture institutes at this Ministry of Culture. Okay, and it was as an afterthought that, oh, okay, so it is more of a bureaucratic view towards promoting and protecting so-called tribal. Even if they had the word indigenous there, it would not make much difference because elsewhere in the constitution, there is no recognition of the linguistic diversity of Bangladesh. There is no acknowledgement to the fact that indigenous peoples have had different relationship to land, etc., etc. So all those have been erased, and Bangladesh is defined as a land of Bengali people. It is the Bengali people who fought for liberation. It is Bengali. So even if you had the word indigenous, that very, very homogeneous notion of nation would still be there. And it is that I think we need to really question rather than the terminology involved. Anyway, so these are the things I have been writing about. And just another piece of, these are my parents. And something just as a background, just as I was very drained, both of them had passed away by that time, but we had a family event in memory of their late parents. And I just thought I would show the photos because look at my father. My parents represent maybe second generation of Tripuras whose families had switched from shifting cultivation to wet rice agriculture. And their cultural model had become the Bengali Babu, which Kobita represented. The Babu class that the British colonial rule had introduced. So Bengali Hindu elite in Calcutta, they were the cultural models. And it is not just the Tripuras, the Chakmas, Marmas, they all followed that Bengali Hindu Babu model. And they are also called Babus. I'm the son of a Babu. And my father went to a college called Sar Ashutosh College, Sar, anyway, signs of colonial traces. So I just showed this picture, and my mother is wearing a sari, not like what Kavita is wearing now. I'm sure Kavita's mother also wore a sari. Now it is, we're trying to change. I have opted not to wear my loincloth because I don't wear it anymore. All right, so tracing various indigenous turns in my life and writing. Frankly, as I was trying to allude to, when I went to study in the US, I wanted to be a computer scientist. Earlier in Bangladesh, I studied engineering for 1 year, and this is what you do, like, what do you want to become, a doctor or an engineer? Or you want to be an officer? This is what, so our aspirations are no longer indigenous, it is that same model, right? In that context, something happened. After 2 years, I wake up one day and I decided I want to study anthropology. I'm exaggerating a bit, but it's exactly like my mind operates like that. Sometimes, I just whimsically decide I'm tired of computer science. I was pretty nerdy back then, but I quit. But then I was asked, what is anthropology? Why are you studying anthropology? Somehow, back then I had this idea that anthropology would give me some kind of power to cope with the loss, because I was very homesick, I was very nostalgic, and my mother had also passed away in 1984 to cancer. I don't know if that had something impact in my mind. I wanted to sort of, maybe knowledge would give me the power to reverse all the dislocation, both personally and in the wider CST region. I had also faced atrocities personally. I was once manhandled by a security personnel in the Chittagong hill tract, so I had all this anger in me. So anyway, but then, and I had friends who had joined the guerrilla force. So I tried to justify, and this is just a quote from my commencement speech. I went to Brandeis University. At our department, I was asked to speak, so I recently found out, I think it's from John Milton's poem. I don't know how he came across that. I share the poet's conviction that those also serve who try to understand and wait. So anyway, but to make a long story short, as you can imagine, so I studied anthropology as an undergraduate only for 2 years, but all my aspirations and dreams were shattered as a graduate student because it was in the mid-1980s. Those of you know who a little bit about all the situation at academia, that was when many disciplines, in particular anthropology, was hit by the postmodern turn. And for some of us, it was extremely paralyzing. And that's not the only reason, but maybe that was one of the intellectual crises that prompted me to return home without finishing my PhD. So my family were extremely disappointed. They wanted me to be the first PhD in anthropology. For all you know, they don't care what PhD, I could be studying dung beetle, whatever. He's the first PhD among the Tripuras. Wow, okay. But for me, it had to mean, and I expected so much out of anthropology, but when I said anthropology, is it handmade into colonialism? I don't believe that it was so simple, but anyway, you have all these intellectual crises, and it didn't give me the intellectual stimulus anymore to go on, so I gave up. But when I returned home, there is actually no home anymore. Sorry, okay. So this is what home looks like now. This picture is, the second picture is taken, like this is me around 1984, and I came back in Bangladesh, and this is like recently, anyhow. I'll just take you, and I'll just quickly show you some photos, and I had actually not personally used the term Adivashi, except I've been trying to do an ethnography of my just my personal archive. So I found a poem I wrote in 1979 as a teenager, homesick in Dhaka, going to a boarding school. I was an Adivashi yesterday, I wrote in Bangla. I practiced Jum cultivation there. And I went back home, and I found so many things. It's a romantic kind of nostalgic poem. But that's about it. As a student of anthropology, I had not had an occasion to deal with the term indigenous, but it was in 1993. By that time, I was teaching a young teacher at university, so I was asked to write the keynote paper. It was the year of the UN's International Year of the World's Indigenous People. It was not yet peoples. Those of you who know the nuances of people versus peoples. So much of what I did in that paper was basically trying to figure out what would be the right word for indigenous in Bangla. Many of you know the word commonly used throughout South Asia is Adivashi. Literally it means original inhabitant, but it has come to acquire the connotation of primitive. So the word Adivashi in Bangla was commonly used as primitive. So they would say, oh, they are the Adivashis, but they are not sons of the soil of this country. And you have books written like that who have gone by Bengali intellectuals which have received awards like that. So many people objected, like, oh, we're not Adivashi, we're not primitive. Why should we call ourselves Adivashi? So things change. Now many people would happy to call themselves Adivashi anyway. But this was the time, 1993, when the indigenous discourse arrived, the international and the sort of the Adivashi. This is something, and so here and there I've been writing on trying to deconstruct various identities like tribal, Pahari, hill people. I have articles like the Colonial Foundation of Hill People. And I would argue that the category Jumma, it is also a sort of, still, it is just a new term, but the categories, it's much more complex. I don't have time to explain all this. But the funny thing, I think this will tell you enough, Jumma literally means Jum cultivators. But the Jumma nationalists who took up arms, they're against Jum. They used to be inspired by Marxist terminology, and I interviewed their leaders. Well, this is a book called Shifting Cultivation in Chittagong Hill Tracts. I was the principal investigator, and Santosh was part of my research team back then, and there were a couple of others. They said, well, in the march for civilization, to move from feudalism to capitalism and then socialism, you have to abandon shifting cultivation. And to date, so this identity, Jumma identity, when you hear the identity, it is very urban, new middle class of the indigenous people. That indigeneity is not the same that would guarantee the protection of the marginal cultivators. It's a very complex issue, and I don't have a simple answer to that. But I write about this, so I'm always misunderstood. I was writing against everybody, so, including myself at times. Anyway, so all I have been doing, I don't have any identity now, because I'm a part-time teacher, and people need, like, he's an officer, like, I don't do anything. I don't have any permanent institutional affiliation anymore. So sometimes people are, he's a writer, okay, for lack of, anyway, but I don't consider myself a writer. These are two books. The first one, both are in Bangla actually. The first one came out in 2015. It's called Bangladesh. My time is out, but I think I'll just take one more minute. Bangladesh of Many Peoples. And the second one, I just sort of wrote the first. And the second one, it's supposed to come out any day. It's in Bangla. I just translated the main title. It's called On the Margins of the Nation State. But I have a slightly optimistic subtitle, long, which may be translated as something like From the Abyss of Marginality to the Dream of the Sky of Dream of something. And in that, I have many things, including one story, which is like a science fiction. I've tried to sort of play on the notion of indigenoushood, in the sense like we're all indigenous to the planet as humans, and we are invaded by aliens who are taking over. So there, I introduced the categories which I may translate the indigenous and indigenous. So I have also an article there like who is with the first Tripura to go to Mars. So there, indigenous are all humans who have not yet been infected by the virus. I mean by the alien life forms. And indigenous are the indigenous people who somehow have immunity, the original indigenous people. So in Mars, they are all joined hands to protect human race and the planet. Anyway, thank you. And sorry, this is last thing. I have, just going over time, this is Joy de Broza, his mention and his artwork you'll find featured in the, I think, the page of this workshop. I have had some conversations with him. I will refer to it in the, but just to end, the article that I started talking about, my conclusion there was that a poet's job is not to reinforce boundaries, but to transcend them. I mean, the category indigenous makes sense for the political rights. When it comes to poetry, I don't think we should use that category. And I would say the same for art as well. Maybe it's a modernist position. We could talk about Chakma aesthetics, Tripura aesthetics, but indigenous, lumping together hundreds or thousands of cultures in one. I just don't think it works, indigenous art. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Prashanta. And I would like to ask for comments and questions.
I have a little bit of a question because I understand your precedence in using a certain terminology, but don't you think it's very dangerous to move away to a certain words and that allow people to ally into a community which has been subject to a certain traumatic experience? And I think that those alliances happen on so many levels, and in the moment in which those categories are completely dispersed, I wonder what happens. I mean, I read your final kind of comment in a very romantic kind of way, but unfortunately we don't live in a very romantic world. So I wonder what's possible to, how it is possible to reuse this vocabulary also to overcome in a different way towards what's the reality of the things around us.
Yeah, I think of, Antonio, thank you for your question. Don't get me wrong, I'm not asking to get rid of the category indigenous. Like, I have written a lot here in Bangladesh, in Bangla mainly, trying to reach to the Bangladeshi audience. And I think things are a bit more complicated in countries like Bangladesh, because in India, I'm sure, and I should add that all the UN discourse about indigenous people, not a single country in Asia supports so far, except Nepal. They have ratified. China, yeah, we support indigenous rights. What they mean for New Zealand, and for Canada, for the US. We don't have a problem. India also says the same position. And it's very complex. They say, we're no longer ruled by the British. We're all indigenous. And this is exactly. But of course we know what it is, right? It's much more nuanced. But the problem is, so you have to, so there are many people, even people who are very sympathetic to the indigenous cause, find it very problematic to these divisions between indigenous and non-indigenous. Many Bengalis say, we are also indigenous. And I have my own answer to them, which I don't have time to go. But what I'm saying is that it can be also the other way around. For example, the book in which I sort of question why I was included. It's none of the poems, they're all written in Bengali and written by people like military officers. You have Raja, king, you have ministers, not by typical Jum cultivators, the aesthetics, the aspirations. It's a very classed thing, and we have to recognize the presence of class. I don't know how it is in other countries, but here, indigenous identity is very classed. And most of the people, and if you just confine everything to aesthetics, etc., and the government is very happy to see you. The government wants us to dance and sing, but not fight for land rights. So we need to keep these things separate. And many among the cultural elite would also show you support, token support. Yes, and you aestheticize their suffering. But there's a clear-cut disconnection between what is going on spaces like this and what is going on every day out in the field. We must recognize that. And I think if you just think that because we are using the term indigenous, we are supporting the cause, I don't think that is so simple. That's why I want to be very careful to use the category indigenous. I'm an indigenous poet because I happen to look like this, or I happen to have my surname. But what cause do I? So my take is that anybody can be indigenous as long as you, and I've written like that, it is in your mind. Do you value equality? Do you value harmony with nature? Do you value sharing? If you do, that is what being indigenous means. And for me, it is not about your where you come from or what you look like, but what do you believe in, your values. This is the position that I'm trying to advocate in my writings.
Prashanta, thank you so much, and I really appreciate your words, and I would add little or acknowledge something because I face also these kind of problems. When I was in Delhi, if you know Delhi, and there's a museum, something people can go and exhibit their work, like Delhi Hat. But there's another run by government, what's the name? I forget that name. In Pragati Maidan, one lady came us, and that's happened yesterday. I told my friend, he was asking about, and I tell the story about that things. What was actually the same day in Sansad Bhavan in Delhi, attacked by terrorists. The same day, before 2 days ago, I was in that museum, and one lady, she's very, art curator or love the art, Adivasi art, called Adivasi art. So, oh, you're not looking like Adivasi? So that means, Adivasi means, my friend replied her, okay ma'am, stand here. I just removed my cloth and, you see me, who I am. So this kind of pain.
Basically the question whether we can have a language about a phenomenon or not have a language. A category will carry, for example, the denotative function, where you try to describe what you describe in a pretty dry way. And then you have the connotation, the connotative side, that evoke memories and emotions and dreams and more of that side. And it's a returning problem in categorizing the indigenous things. That can also apply for the Sami people, because the legalistic language, legalese, which is sort of behind this urge to categorize and to have unified and precise categories. That is a language of uniformity, a militaristic language, so to speak, that categories shall be uniform. And we come from worlds that are not uniformistic. So that is our starting point. But then then the question then becomes, if we could we speak about indigenous? Should we have a language about that? should we do as Wittgenstein says, that what we can't say, that we can't speak about, that we shall not speak about. So that is the dilemma, because there are so many things that are connected to the categorization. For example, we have in Sami music. Should that music be categorized as world music? Should it be categorized as folk music, as a kind of rock music, and so on? So what category should it be placed in? The implication of placing something into a category is that you can get your music sold, or like you say about is it Chakma art or is it not Chakma art? So and that is a very big dilemma. We all have been fallen in deeply in love once or twice or 3 times or 4 times in our lives, and the love feels so strong that language can't sort of express that. And it's a related dilemma, this, because the indigenous experience are very painful, are very shameful, but at the same time they can be the gate for getting funding, getting access, and so on. So it then becomes a bargain to how should one then deal with the game of categorization. And I feel it very interesting that you suggest that we should abandon, because the implication of your point, even though you said just that it was not your intention, but the implication becomes that we should stop talking about that.
Thank you. It's definitely meant to be those.
We're called Indigenous, we're called Blacks, we're called Avos, we're called many things, and we're called First Nations, we're called Indigenous, etc. So mainly in this, you mixed up lots of things about aesthetics to do with language and visual arts you were talking about, etc. All I came back to in my my line of thinking was Aboriginal art. We could say it's Aboriginal art, you could say it's Indigenous art. Indigenous art is art made by Indigenous people. So it could be any form. It's not a denotion that this is primitive or anything else. It's saying, well, this is this group that made this thing. And you can then have an endless conversation about aesthetics and what denotes to be Indigenous. We won't solve that problem here today, I don't think. And there definitely is class structures, so that people, as you said, some people within those struggles are obviously looking after their own end of things, and they don't think about the people on the bottom. We know the people on the bottom always get run over anyway. I don't say we should accept that, but we know this happens. So there are people at the top who will define things. I just reached a consciousness of myself as an Aboriginal person. I could be called an Indigenous person, but I don't see myself as inferior. I don't see myself as primitive. I don't see myself as immoral or lesser than any other person. And I think the consciousness of what is Indigenous, what is Aboriginal, or what is Adivasi, or myself, I'm a Bunjalung person, I know that is not inferior, and I don't accept that from anyone. I find my parents taught me many things, to have manners. We were taught never to mock the mentally afflicted, never poke fun at people that are mentally afflicted. And so anyone who says Aboriginal people or Indigenous people are primitive or lesser than, well, they're mentally afflicted. They are the lesser brain, they are the lesser civilization, and they are just there. There are people who are lesser morally, mentally, or whatever, and I have just taken that all art made by Aboriginals is not inferior. It's there. It's contemporary because it's made now, like your poetry is made about this problem. You're writing these thoughts, and they are contemporary, and they're not inferior, and you should never accept that. I know we work against a system that will continually try to push you down, but at least your books are published. And the last speaker, we were talking about films, it's all right to make films, it's all right to write my own thoughts. How do you get them distributed and into a system? And that's what we should be thinking about, not about don't think that they're in any way inferior or lesser than anything else. We've just got to get them out into the system to the other persons in the world, to get them to read these things, to see those films, because all that art, well, I think it was Santos yesterday was saying about what art is. Art is a sense of yourself, and I always think any art is it's aimed at you're having a conversation with yourself, but you're trying to have a conversation with some other people. And that will only happen if you get things out so other people can see them or read them. I like the fact that you publish these books in your own language, so your own group can read these. That is a really incredible thing to do, to write that in your own language and get it out. But I think the conversation's got to go out to other people. So although I could work in an institution and be institutionalized, I'd rather work outside, and my practice is to publish widely as I can, to put exhibitions together as widely as I can, so that will start a conversation of some sorts. That's what I think. I won't diminish your argument or your discussion about it's just a matter of semantics in some ways, because people will always call you this or that. I said we're called abos, we're called niggers, we're called black people, and many other insulting names. So you just have to brush that off. You'll be called many things in your life, rightly or wrongly. You've just got to keep going on the straight path, keep advancing. And I think the fact that you're publishing those books and about these thoughts is a good thing. That's all. Thank you, if that makes sense.
I just wanted to add something. Yeah, I just wanted to add one thing in this discussion about labeling Indigenous in any I don't know, fields or whatever. And I find one aspect that's really very positive and of great value.
Thank you. It's definitely meant to be food for thought. I don't think I'm saying that we abandon the category, but I think all I'm saying is that we must keep it strongly rooted to the political economic demands, which are not necessarily sort of can be simply related to linguistic, cultural, or aesthetic issues. For example, let me see if I can give an example. I mean, there are some 7,000 languages in the world, and of those, I think the majority are. Now, their status as indigenous, what it means is that they don't have official recognition, but there are also many other non-indigenous languages which don't have that. But you cannot say, you cannot understand the languages as language. The category indigenous is totally irrelevant. If you study linguistics, you know indigenous doesn't help us understand those languages. Similarly, when we're talking about art, aesthetics, there's so many different variations, like art is linked with religion, but you cannot say, and the category indigenous also historically, this is the anthropologist in me saying, it sort of represents a huge range from pre-state tribal societies to state societies like the Inca and Aztec. So you cannot lump together like there is a indigenous political culture as such. I mean, indigenous, so-called in that context, indigeneity is actually not about what I was trying to say, sharing, etc. But here I'm reducing it to some kind of archetypical. And what I'm talking about is here in Bangladesh, many people who subscribe to so-called indigenous rights in our context, they don't care about the marginal segments of the indigenous people in our own country. This is what people like me. So what I'm trying to say, when I talk about, I took to the streets or I write for indigenous rights, it's not about my rights. It's about my cousins, my brothers and sisters who are still struggling for their right to cultivate Jum. I no longer depend on Jum. So it is, I always have to take pains to clarify it's not about me. It's not about my rights. It's about somebody else's, and I happen to come from the same roots. But it could be also you, anybody. We must take that stance.